Welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I am Amarachi Ubani. U.S. President Donald Trump has fired Secretary of State Rex Tillerson over a few differences in their approach to foreign policy. The president made the announcement via Twitter barely 24 hours after Mr. Tillerson arrived in the United States, having cut short his visit to Nigeria, spending only a few hours before heading back home. In his tweet, the president said he had tapped CIA boss Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State and his successor at the CIA. And at a press briefing just outside the White House a few hours later, the president praised Pompeo for being
sometime. Tremendous energy, tremendous intellect. We're always on the same wavelength. The relationship has been very good, and that's what I need as Secretary of State. I wish Rex Tillerson well.
He also gave reasons why he was letting Tillerson go.
We have a very good relationship for whatever reason, chemistry, whatever it is. Why do people get along? I've always, right from the beginning, from day one, I've gotten along well with Mike Pompeo. And frankly, I get along well with Rex, too.
After 14 months as Secretary of State, a calm, collected Rex Tillerson gave his statement on the termination of his appointment.
My commission as Secretary of State will terminate at midnight, March the 31st. Between now and then, I will address a few administrative matters related to my departure and work towards a smooth and orderly transition for Secretary of State designate Mike Pompeo.
The sudden change, of course, sends surprise and shockwaves around the world, but the Nigerian government says it will not affect Nigeria-U.S. relations because government is a continuum. Minister of Foreign Affairs Jeffrey Onyema says he expects all discussions held during Mr. Tillerson's recent visit to Nigeria as regards both countries' relations to stand. Earlier, I had a chat with former U.S. Ambassador Robin Sanders on this and other issues surrounding U.S.-Nigeria and Africa relations. And being Women's History Month, she has been in the country for a special reason. Ambassador Sanders, thank you for speaking with us. You have been a regular visitor to Nigeria even after you became ambassador, and it just seems like you never really left.
Well, thank you, Amarachi. It's good to see you again. I've been back and forth over the last 5 or 6 years, at least twice or 3 times a year, but Nigeria feels like my second home to me all the time.
And you're here because?
I was invited to participate in 2 days at the President Obasanjo Library that was focused on women training, particularly for SMEs. And so I spent those 2 days in Abeokuta, and then the rest of the week here, doing the same thing and certainly opening up this training center for Africa SME women or Nigerian women focused on small businesses. And it's connected in a good bit to a book that I wrote on the same subject and how important it is for women to have entrepreneurial businesses to take care of themselves and their families.
Now, most recently, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was in Africa on a 5-nation tour. What was the motivation for this visit?
Yeah, I think that up until recently, there wasn't a lot of focus by the administration on Africa, and I think that the initial thought behind the Tillerson visit was to change that perception that the U.S. wasn't going to be as engaged as it had been in the continent. So I think it was a good idea for the trip. And I think that I'm hoping that it had some impact to change any perception that the U.S. is not seeing Africa as a strategic partner.
Well, you can't blame Africa. You have a president who says America first.
Well, I think that a lot has been put on that term, America first. I think that for any country, it's their country first. Even for Nigeria, it's Nigeria first. But I do think that there's some merit to that perception that Africans were having about the U.S. over the last year. And I think one of the reasons for the trip that Tillerson made was to try to change that perception. And I don't know yet, what kind of impact his trip had. I thought that the idea of the trip was great. I thought the countries that he chose were great. I was a little bit bothered by some of the messages, I think, beating up on China during the time he was here. Bothered me a bit because, African nations are sophisticated, their leaders are, their people are, and so it was a little neo-colonialist from my perspective, my humble corner of the world. So that part bothered me, but I thought that, the message of partnership and that we want to remain engaged in Nigeria and across the continent was a good one. So I'm hoping that that's began to change the perception a little bit, that we're not going to be as involved as we have been in other administrations.
And you blame China. When I say you, I mean the U.S., not you per se. But the U.S. blames China for having such a strong foothold in Africa, whereas it does appear that, the U.S. has been missing in some instances.
There's a huge chapter in my book where I talk about the China factor in Africa, and I was just at the U.S. Confucius Center as well. And my view is, China's relationship with Africa or vice versa, that's between the continent and China in terms of how you want to define that relationship for yourself as a nation. I have absolutely no problem with the strategic partnerships, the engagement. I actually think China is doing a very good job of focusing on infrastructure development, what they're doing in East Africa, building railroads and things that we don't do. And it's our fault that we're not doing those. So I'm not in that corner. I know there are Americans who, have that viewpoint. I'm not one of those. I always give China credit for its involvement, for its leadership. I'm not saying that everything they do I agree with, but I certainly think they have a deeper viewpoint on how they want to engage, and they look like they're engaged for the long term. And we don't have that perception here, and I'd like to see us change that.
And Mr. Tillerson, when he was in Africa, warned nations against accepting Chinese loans, saying we must carefully consider agreements with China. What do you think he meant by that, and do you think there is some truth in there?
I think there's a little bit of truth in there. I would even say, when I looked at my time as a diplomat and the change in the China-Africa relationship over the years, I think that China's gotten a lot more sophisticated in terms of how it engages with Africa. But I do think the onus of the responsibility of what those contracts look like is up to the African leaders. I mean, it's your resources, it's your relationship with that nation that you're trying to manage and determine. I don't think it's up to us. I think it's up to your leaders, and it's their responsibility to make sure that those contracts and those relationships benefit their nations, their respective nations.